Dearest listeners, there exists no greater irony in all of fashionable society than when Cupid's arrow strikes precisely where duty already demands. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of two hearts destined for union, yet determined to choose their own path to love's embrace. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Burgundy, must be savored properly. The spring of 1815 found London's drawing rooms abuzz with speculation regarding the impending alliance between two of England's most distinguished families. Before we delve deeper into this most intriguing arrangement, dear listeners, if you find yourself captivated by tales of hearts and society, do favor this chronicler with your continued patronage. Press that like button as one would accept a calling card. Subscribe to receive future chronicles delivered to your door as faithfully as the Morning Post, and share your thoughts in the comments below, for your humble author delights in discourse as much as any bluestocking at a literary salon. At the heart of this orchestrated arrangement was Lady Violet Harrington, a creature of such singular determination that even the formidable Duke of Harrington, her father, occasionally found himself outmaneuvered in matters of household governance. Yet in the matter of her matrimonial destiny, His Grace remained immovable as Gibraltar itself. The Harrington lineage stretched back to the Conquest, a fact His Grace mentioned with the regularity of church bells on Sunday. Their Mayfair residence stood as a testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and influence, its marble halls echoing with the footsteps of kings and queens who had graced their threshold. Yet for all this illustrious history, the Duke harbored an obsession that consumed his waking hours: the forging of an alliance with the Pemberton family, whose fortune, acquired through shrewd investments in the colonies and judicious management of extensive holdings, had grown to rival that of Croesus himself. Lady Violet, at 22, had successfully deflected 3 seasons' worth of suitors through a combination of wit, strategic rudeness, and an alarming tendency to discuss topics deemed wholly inappropriate for feminine conversation. She had discoursed upon the complexities of the Corn Law, then being debated in Parliament at Almack's, debated the merits of Wordsworth's poetry with such passion that she had driven 2 prospective suitors to claim pressing business elsewhere, and once, memorably, had begun explaining the principles of crop rotation to a viscount during what should have been a romantic turn about the garden. The other young ladies of the ton whispered that Lady Violet was deliberately sabotaging her prospects, and indeed, they were not entirely mistaken. Violet had read far too many novels, spent far too many hours in her father's library, and entertained far too many dangerous notions about marriage being a partnership of minds as well as fortunes. She had observed her parents' union, a perfectly respectable arrangement that had produced the requisite heir and spare, yet contained all the warmth of a January morning, and determined that such a fate would not befall her. When the Duke had announced, with all the ceremony of a royal proclamation, that she was to wed Mr. Julian Pemberton, second son of the Pemberton dynasty, Violet had felt the walls of her gilded cage closing inexorably inward. She had never met the gentleman in question, knew nothing of him, save that he was reported to be handsome, educated, and in possession of a considerable independence settled upon him by his doting mother. These facts, which would have sent other young ladies into raptures, filled Violet with nothing but dread. The betrothal, the Duke explained with infinite patience, would unite 2 great families, secure the Harrington line's financial future for generations, and position them advantageously in the increasingly complex world of commerce and influence. The Duke spoke with the gravity of a man who secretly feared that ancient names and storied lineages were no longer enough in a world increasingly run by commerce and industry. He saw the Pemberton alliance not just as an opportunity, but as a necessary fortification against the slow erosion of their world. That his daughter might have preferences in the matter had simply never entered his calculations, as one does not consult the pawn before moving it across the chessboard. Violet had spent 3 sleepless nights pacing her chambers, her mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities alike. Her mother, the Duchess, had visited her with well-meaning advice about duty, obligation, and the eventual comfort of a well-ordered household. Her younger brother, Lord Edmund, had suggested she simply do as she was told and save everyone the bother of an extended rebellion. Even her maid, the faithful Agnes, who had served her since childhood, had urged acceptance, painting rosy pictures of a fine establishment, beautiful gowns, and the respect due to a married lady of quality. Yet something within Violet's breast rebelled against this fate with the fury of a cornered fox. She had read of the Americas, where fortunes were made by daring and wit rather than inherited. She had heard tales of women who ran businesses, managed properties, lived lives of independence and purpose. Why should she, who could read Latin and Greek, who understood mathematics and natural philosophy, who possessed a mind as sharp as any gentleman's, be reduced to an ornament in someone else's drawing room? The notion of escape had come to her on the fourth night, arriving with the peculiar clarity that sometimes accompanies desperation. She would disappear into London's vastness, that great sprawling city where millions lived in anonymity. She would take only what she could carry, dress in simple garments, and discover whether the world beyond Mayfair held any place for a young woman of determination and modest means. Agnes, when approached with this scheme, had initially declared it madness. The London streets were no place for a gently bred lady, she had insisted. The dangers were manifold, the proprieties impossible to maintain. Yet Violet had worn down her resistance through a combination of pleading and logic. She did not propose to vanish forever, merely to gain a fortnight's reprieve, time enough to think, to plan, perhaps to discover some alternative to the cage that awaited her. The arrangements had been made with surprising ease. Agnes had a sister in Bloomsbury, a respectable widow who let rooms to single ladies of modest means. A small trunk of plain gowns had been assembled, the kind a governess or shopgirl might wear. Violet had withdrawn what funds she could access from her quarterly allowance, converting jewelry gifts from godparents into coin through a discreet jeweler's shop that asked no questions of genteel ladies requiring ready money. On a Tuesday evening, while the Duke and Duchess attended a diplomatic reception at Carlton House, Lady Violet Harrington had simply walked out of her father's house. She had descended the servants' stairs, crossed the mews where the stable boys paid her no mind in her simple dark cloak, and stepped into a hackney coach that Agnes had summoned. Within the hour, she had ceased to be Lady Violet and had become simply Miss Violet Hart, a young woman of respectable but unremarkable background, seeking temporary lodging while she secured a position as a companion or governess. Mrs. Davies, Agnes's sister, had accepted this fiction with the knowing look of one who had seen much in her 45 years. She asked no probing questions, demanded payment in advance, and showed Violet to a small but clean chamber overlooking a modest garden. The room held a narrow bed, a washstand, a simple wardrobe, and a writing desk positioned beneath the window. It was, Violet thought with something approaching wonder, the first space in her life that was truly her own, unadorned by ancestral portraits or weighed down by the expectations of generations. Gone were the silken sheets and morning chocolate brought by smiling maids. In their place came the bracing shock of cold water in a plain ceramic basin, the unfamiliar ache in her arms as she dressed herself without assistance, and the lingering scent of boiled cabbage from Mrs. Davies's kitchen that clung to the hallway. In Mayfair, the air smelled of beeswax and lemon polish. Here, it smelled of life, unfiltered and unadorned. Yet with these privations came an extraordinary lightness of being. Violet discovered that she could walk the streets of Bloomsbury without constant supervision, could enter shops and libraries at will, could engage in conversation with tradespeople and fellow lodgers without consideration of rank or precedence. She was, for the first time in her existence, invisible, and in that invisibility found an intoxicating freedom. It was in Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, that temple of literature where the fashionable and learned came to worship at the altar of the printed word, that Violet's carefully constructed anonymity first showed signs of unraveling. She had ventured there on her 5th morning of liberty, drawn by an advertisement for a new translation of Ovid that had caught her attention in the Morning Chronicle. The shop at midday proved less crowded than during the fashionable afternoon hours, containing only a scattering of serious readers and scholars rather than the parade of society figures who came to be seen as much as to purchase volumes. Violet had dressed with particular care in her most sober gray gown, a bonnet that concealed much of her face, and the demeanor of a governess on her afternoon liberty. She moved through the stacks with the easy familiarity of one who had spent countless hours in her father's extensive library, her fingers trailing along leather spines as she navigated toward the classical texts. She had just located the Ovid, had opened it to examine the quality of the translation, when a masculine voice spoke from behind her shoulder. The gentleman's tone carried that particular quality of someone continuing a conversation begun in his own mind, unaware he was addressing a stranger. The voice observed that Dryden's translation remained superior for its poetry, though it took certain liberties with the literal text that scholars found troubling. Violet, startled but unable to resist engaging on a topic dear to her heart, had turned to reply that while Dryden's verses sang beautifully, they sometimes obscured Ovid's more subversive meanings beneath English propriety. The gentleman before her bore the unmistakable marks of quality in his dress and bearing, yet something in his manner suggested a man uncomfortable with the trappings of his station. He was a man of perhaps 24 or 25, with dark hair that suggested recent contact with wind rather than careful arrangement, gray eyes that held genuine intelligence rather than fashionable ennui, and an expression of delighted surprise at finding someone willing to debate translation theory in a bookshop. What followed could only be described as a most improper conversation between strangers who had not been formally introduced, who possessed no mutual acquaintance to facilitate such introduction, and who violated every principle of proper behavior by finding themselves utterly absorbed in discourse. They debated the merits of various translators, discussed the scandal of Lord Elgin's marbles and whether ancient art belonged in private collections or public museums, and somehow found themselves examining a newly published treatise on natural philosophy that neither had intended to purchase, but both found fascinating. The gentleman, who had introduced himself as Mr. James Hartwell, possessed a mind that moved with the same quickness as Violet's own. He neither condescended to her understanding, nor seemed shocked by the breadth of her reading. When she referenced Newton's Principia, he responded with commentary on more recent developments in mathematical theory. When he mentioned agricultural reforms, he spoke with an authority that hinted at more than just reading, and she countered with observations about the social displacement such improvements often caused among tenant farmers. An hour passed with the swiftness of minutes. They had progressed from the classical section to travels, from travels to political economy, from political economy to poetry, their arms growing heavy with volumes they had pulled down to illustrate various points of discussion. Mr. Hartwell had laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure rather than the practiced social laugh of the drawing room, when Violet had expressed a particularly strong opinion about Byron's recent works, which she found simultaneously brilliant and morally problematic. It was only when the shop assistant had approached to inquire whether they required assistance carrying their selected volumes to the counter that the spell had broken. Violet, suddenly aware of how far she had strayed from proper conduct, had felt the heat of mortification color her cheeks. She had murmured something about the lateness of the hour, had selected only the Ovid from her accumulated stack, and had moved toward the counter with unseemly haste. Mr. Hartwell had followed, insisting on purchasing not only his own selections, but also adding to her single volume a beautiful edition of Virgil's Georgics and a collection of Cowper's poems. When she had protested this presumption, he had smiled with devastating effect and claimed they were payment for the most intellectually stimulating hour he had spent in London this season. Before she could refuse, he had completed the transaction and pressed the wrapped volumes into her hands. As they stood on the pavement outside Hatchard's, the noise and bustle of Piccadilly swirling around them, Mr. Hartwell had done something quite extraordinary. Rather than presuming to know her direction and offering escort, Rather than asking intrusive questions about her circumstances, he had simply expressed his hope that they might encounter each other again among the bookshelves, as he found himself in frequent need of educated conversation that did not revolve around weather, scandal, or horses. Violet had fled back to Bloomsbury with her heart performing alarming acrobatics within her chest. She had never, in 3 full seasons of balls and morning calls, met a gentleman who had engaged her mind with such effect. The young men of her acquaintance either seemed intimidated by her intelligence or resentful of it, treating her learning as an unfortunate aberration to be overlooked rather than appreciated. Mr. Hartwell had spoken to her as an equal, had matched her thought for thought, had seemed genuinely delighted by her contributions to their discourse. That evening, alone in her small chamber, Violet had opened the Georgics to discover a card tucked within its pages. The handwriting was bold and clear, the message simple. The writer would be amongst the scholars in the study rooms at the British Museum on Thursday afternoon, should Miss Hart wish to continue their discussion of ancient civilizations and modern interpretations thereof. No presumption of acceptance, no demand for response, merely an invitation extended to a fellow scholar. Violet knew she should not go. Every principle of proper conduct screamed against such a meeting. Yet she found herself counting the hours until Thursday arrived. The British Museum had proven an inspired choice for a clandestine meeting, if such it could be called. The great institution attracted scholars, artists, and the genuinely curious, providing perfect camouflage for 2 people who wished to converse without the constraints of formal society. Violet had arrived to find Mr. Hartwell already present, examining the Rosetta Stone with an expression of such absorbed concentration that she had hesitated to interrupt his contemplation. He had sensed her presence, had turned with that same expression of delighted surprise she had witnessed at Hatchard's, and had proceeded to guide her through the Egyptian galleries with the enthusiasm of a man sharing treasures with someone capable of appreciating them. They had stood before ancient artifacts discussing the rise and fall of civilizations, the nature of power and memory, the question of whether any human achievement could truly outlast time's erosion. From the museum, their steps had taken them quite accidentally, or so they both pretended, toward the park. Hyde Park, at the unfashionable hour of late afternoon, held fewer promenading members of the ton and more ordinary Londoners taking advantage of fine weather. They had walked the paths discussing everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on matters great and small, finding themselves surprised by how naturally conversation flowed between them. Mr. Hartwell, Violet learned, had spent time on the continent before Napoleon's return from Elba had made such travel impossible. He had studied at Oxford but found academic life too confined, preferring to pursue his various interests independently. He spoke little of his family beyond mentioning that expectations sometimes weighed heavily upon a man, even when material circumstances were comfortable. There was, she sensed, some burden he carried, some constraint against which his spirit chafed, though he did not speak of it directly. For her part, Violet had maintained her fiction of being Miss Hart, a young woman of respectable family now reduced to seeking genteel employment. She had implied, without stating directly, that financial reverses had altered her circumstances. The lies had tasted bitter on her tongue, yet she could not bring herself to reveal her true identity and watch his manner change from equality to the careful deference paid to rank. 3 more meetings had followed over the course of a week. Each had the appearance of accident, encountering each other at a circulating library, meeting while sheltering from rain in the portico of St. Paul's, discovering themselves at the same print shop, examining the latest satirical cartoons. Yet both knew these accidents were carefully orchestrated, that each watched for the other, that their separate routines had adjusted to create opportunities for intersection. What Violet did not know, could not have known, was that Mr. James Hartwell was himself a fiction, a convenient construction designed to permit its creator a measure of freedom from his own gilded cage. The gentleman who had so thoroughly captured her attention and admiration was in truth Mr. Julian Pemberton, second son of the Pemberton Empire, and the very man her father had selected to be her husband. Julian had escaped London society's suffocating embrace for reasons that paralleled Violet's own with uncanny precision. The Pemberton fortune, built by his grandfather through shipping interests and expanded by his father through investments that bordered on genius, had grown to proportions that attracted every fortune hunter in England. Young ladies who had never noticed Julian's existence suddenly found him fascinating. Their mamas engineered encounters with all the subtlety of military campaigns. He could not attend a ball without being cornered, could not ride in the park without being intercepted, could not visit his club without finding himself engaged in conversations clearly designed to demonstrate some young lady's superior qualities. The final insult had come when he learned of his parents' arrangement with the Duke of Harrington. They had presented it as a fait accompli, a settled matter requiring only his formal acquiescence. Lady Violet Harrington, they explained, came from impeccable lineage. The alliance would position the Pemberton family firmly within the highest circles of the aristocracy, something his parents' commercial origins had never quite achieved despite their wealth. Julian would make an advantageous match. Lady Violet would gain a husband of means and character. The families would unite their considerable resources, and everyone would profit. That neither Julian nor Lady Violet had been consulted about their preferences in the matter seemed to concern no one. When Julian had suggested he might wish to meet the young lady before committing to marriage, his mother had laughed and reminded him that love was a luxury of the lower classes, while people of quality understood that compatible interests and mutual respect developed after marriage rather than before. Julian had attempted to learn something of his intended bride through discreet inquiries. The reports he received painted a portrait of a sharp-tongued bluestocking who had frightened away every eligible gentleman in London. She was reported to be handsome but difficult, intelligent but argumentative, refined but distressingly opinionated. Several gentlemen had mentioned her alarming tendency to express thoughts on matters that should not concern feminine minds. One had described her as a thoroughly modern girl, which is not at all meant as a compliment. While these descriptions should have filled Julian with dread, a small rebellious part of him felt a flicker of intrigue. The woman sounded formidable and utterly exhausting, yet not, perhaps, entirely dull. It was a thought he quickly suppressed. These descriptions had done nothing to reconcile Julian to his fate. He found himself facing marriage to a woman whose entire character seemed to have been constructed to make both their lives miserable. She would resent him for the arrangement, he would resent the obligation, and they would spend their years in the sort of cold, formal coexistence that passed for marriage in their circles. His escape had been facilitated by his former tutor, Mr. Hartwell, who had retired to a cottage in Berkshire but maintained rooms in London for his occasional visits. The man had understood Julian's predicament and offered the use of his name and lodgings for a fortnight. Julian need only avoid his usual haunts, dress slightly less fashionably than his custom, and enjoy a brief period of anonymity before duty claimed him. Meeting Violet, or rather Miss Hart, as he knew her, had been the purest accident. He had truly been absorbed in examining translations when he had spoken aloud without realizing anyone was near. Her response had startled him, but her evident knowledge and quick understanding had captivated him entirely. Here was a woman who engaged with ideas rather than merely parroting opinions learned by rote. Here was a mind that moved with agility and genuine curiosity. Here was someone he could actually talk to rather than at or around. Each subsequent meeting had only deepened his admiration. Miss Hart possessed a quality rare in his experience: authenticity. She said what she thought, argued when she disagreed, laughed when genuinely amused rather than tittering behind her fan at appropriate intervals. She wore plain gowns without apology, walked without affectation, and seemed utterly uninterested in impressing him with accomplishments or connections. Julian found himself thinking of her at odd moments, replaying their conversations, anticipating their next encounter with an eagerness that alarmed him. He recognized the symptoms, even as he tried to deny them. He was falling in love with Miss Hart, this mysterious young woman of uncertain circumstances and undeniable intelligence, even as his parents planned his wedding to the formidable Lady Violet Harrington. The situation would have been comical had it not been so thoroughly tragic. He stood on the precipice of an arranged marriage while his heart insisted on choosing elsewhere. Miss Hart, for her part, had made it clear through various small comments that she too was escaping some unwanted fate, though she had not elaborated on its nature. He sensed pain behind her determination to remain in her reduced circumstances, wondered what had driven someone of evident education and refinement to such a state. Their sixth meeting, which took place in the gardens at Vauxhall during a quiet afternoon when the pleasure gardens welcomed daytime visitors at reduced rates, had marked a turning point in their careful dance. They had walked among the sculpture and through the covered walkways, their conversation turning from intellectual matters to more personal territory. Julian had spoken with careful vagueness about feeling trapped by others' expectations, about wanting to build something of his own merit rather than simply inheriting position. Violet had responded with feeling about the suffocation of living according to others' designs, about the desire to make choices rather than merely accept what was chosen for her. Their words had created a web of understanding between them, each revelation drawing them closer even as they maintained the fictions of their assumed names. It was there, in a secluded bower where heavy-headed peonies were in full bloom, that Julian had done something entirely improper. He had taken Violet's hand, her bare hand, for she wore no gloves in her simple guise, and had spoken words that committed him irrevocably. He had told her that whatever circumstances bound him, whatever obligations awaited, he had never met anyone who understood him as she did. He had confessed that their accidental encounters had become the center around which his days revolved. He had admitted that he found himself wishing he could be simply James Hartwell permanently, free to court Miss Hart properly, free to build a life uncomplicated by duty and expectation. Violet had responded with tears glistening in her remarkable eyes. She had confessed her own growing attachment, had admitted that she thought of him constantly, had revealed that their time together represented everything she had always imagined a true partnership of minds might be. Yet she too was bound by circumstances she could not yet escape, was fleeing an arranged future that seemed increasingly inevitable despite her rebellion. Neither had spoken the word love, yet it hung between them unacknowledged, a truth too dangerous to voice aloud. They remained there, hands clasped, hearts racing, both knowing they stood at the edge of something that could not end happily, yet neither willing to step back from the precipice. Julian had proposed in that moment a reckless solution. They could leave London together, could make their way to Scotland, where marriages required no bans or parental consent, could build a life together free from the constraints that bound them. He had enough independence, he assured her, to support them modestly but respectably. They would have each other, their books, their conversations, and the freedom to live as they chose. Violet had been tempted, dangerously, desperately tempted. For a moment, she had envisioned it. A small cottage somewhere, a life built on genuine affection rather than social calculation. The possibility of true happiness rather than merely acceptable arrangement. Yet even as the vision formed, she recognized its impossibility. She could not let Julian sacrifice everything for a woman whose true identity he did not know. When he learned she was Lady Violet Harrington, would he believe she had not manipulated the encounter? Would he think she had staged their meetings, knowing all along who he truly was? The deception that had seemed harmless, even necessary at the beginning, now stood between them like an insurmountable wall. Violet had extracted her hand gently, had stepped back with visible effort, had spoken words that cost her dearly. She could not marry him, she had said. There were complications he did not understand, obligations she could not break without causing harm to others. She cared for him too much to let him ruin himself for her sake. Julian had pressed her to explain, had demanded to know what could possibly stand between two people who had found such rare understanding. Violet had remained firm, had insisted only that circumstances made their union impossible, had begged him to trust that she acted from necessity rather than choice. They had parted that day with something broken between them, the ease and joy of their earlier meetings shattered by the weight of unnamed obligations and unspoken truths. Julian had walked away looking as though she had struck him, while Violet had returned to her lodgings and wept as she had not done since childhood. 3 days of mutual misery followed. Julian had thrown himself into preparing for the inevitable, his fortnight of freedom drawing to a close. He had received increasingly urgent messages from his family demanding his return, reminding him of his obligations, informing him that the Duke of Harrington was growing impatient and the betrothal ball could not be delayed much longer. The date had been set. In 1 week's time, he would be formally presented to Lady Violet Harrington as her intended husband, and their engagement would be announced to all of fashionable society. Violet, meanwhile, had watched the same deadline approach with mounting dread. Her father's agents had been searching for her. Mrs. Davies had mentioned, with careful neutrality, that a very distinguished gentleman had been making inquiries in the neighborhood, distributing her description and offering a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts. It was only a matter of time before someone connected Miss Hart with the missing Lady Violet Harrington. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Violet had ventured to Hatchard's one final time, drawn by a melancholy desire to revisit the place where her brief happiness had begun. She had not expected to find Julian there, had assumed he would be avoiding places where they might encounter each other. Yet he was there in the poetry section, examining a volume with such absorption that he did not notice her approach. The sight of him had stolen her breath. In 4 days, he had somehow become even more essential to her than she had realized. The thought of marrying some unknown Mr. Pemberton, of spending her life with a stranger while knowing that Julian existed somewhere in the world, seemed suddenly unbearable beyond description. She had spoken his assumed name softly. He had turned, and the naked emotion in his face had nearly undone her resolve. Without speaking, he had guided her to a quiet corner of the shop, behind shelves where they could speak without being overheard by other patrons. Julian had begun by apologizing for pressing her too hard, for proposing solutions without understanding her circumstances. Yet he could not, he insisted, simply accept her refusal without making one more attempt to understand what stood between them. He had spent 3 days trying to imagine obstacles so insurmountable that they could not be overcome by 2 people determined to be together, and he had failed to conceive of any that seemed adequate. Violet had fought against the urge to confess everything, to reveal her identity and let whatever happened happen. Yet fear held her tongue, not fear of his reaction, but fear of the hurt that would come when he realized she had deceived him, even if unintentionally at first. She had chosen instead to speak in generalizations, to explain that she came from circumstances vastly different from her current situation, that her family had plans for her that did not include marrying a gentleman of modest means, that to defy them would bring consequences not just for herself, but for others she cared for. Julian had countered each point systematically. If her family were wealthy, he had resources of his own that might make him acceptable. If they objected to his connections, he could provide references that would satisfy even the most exacting standards. If they demanded a certain style of living, he could offer more than the modest existence she might assume from his simple presentation. His persistence had forced Violet into a corner. She had finally confessed that the greatest obstacle was not his unsuitability, but rather that she was already promised to another, that an arrangement had been made without her consent, but with binding legal implications, that her family would never release her from an obligation they considered settled. The pain in Julian's expression had been terrible to witness. He had asked if she loved this other man, this unknown gentleman who had been given what Julian wanted so desperately. Violet had been able to answer that question with complete honesty. She despised the very idea of him, resented him for existing, hated the fate that bound her to someone chosen not by her heart, but by her father's ambitions. Julian had seized on this admission. If she did not love her intended, if the engagement was purely a matter of family arrangement, then surely she could find some way to break it. Engagements could be ended, contracts dissolved, if both parties agreed. Perhaps this Mr. Whoever he was would prove reasonable when he learned the lady's affections were engaged elsewhere. Violet had laughed bitterly at this suggestion. The gentleman in question, she had explained, came from a family obsessed with securing aristocratic connections. He would never willingly release her, not because he wanted her specifically, but because she represented something valuable to his family's ambitions. Her father would never agree to dissolve an arrangement he considered the crowning achievement of his career as matchmaker. She was trapped as surely as any creature in a snare. It was then that Julian had made his most dangerous proposal. He had suggested that she could simply refuse to marry this other man, could create such a scandal that the engagement became impossible to maintain. She could elope with him, damn the consequences. Her family might disown her, society might cut her, but she would be free, and they would be together. The temptation had been exquisite torture. Violet had allowed herself, for one brief moment, to imagine accepting. Then reality had reasserted itself with crushing force. She could not destroy her family's standing in society, could not harm her innocent brother's prospects, could not be so selfish as to put her own happiness above the welfare of everyone connected to her name. She had explained this to Julian as gently as she could, had watched hope die in his eyes even as he tried to maintain his composure. They had stood there in that corner of the bookshop, surrounded by words written by others, unable to find their own to bridge the chasm between them. Julian had finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken throughout their acquaintance. He had asked if she loved him, not as a friend or intellectual companion, but with the depth of feeling that made separation unbearable. He had claimed no right to ask, had acknowledged he had no authority to demand such a confession, but had needed to know whether his own tumultuous emotions were shared or merely suffered alone. Violet had found herself unable to maintain her defenses in the face of such naked vulnerability. She had answered him honestly, her voice breaking on the words. Yes, she loved him. Yes, she thought of him constantly. Yes, the idea of marrying another man while knowing he existed was torture beyond description. Yes, if circumstances were different, she would accept his proposal without hesitation. But circumstances were not different, and love alone could not overcome the realities that bound them both. Julian had taken her face in his hands, a gesture so improper they both should have recoiled from it, yet neither moved. He had told her that he loved her with an intensity that frightened him, that he had never believed such connection possible between two people, that he would wait for her however long necessary, that he would find some way to free them both, even if it took years. They had stood frozen in that moment, balanced between possibility and impossibility, until the shop assistant had coughed discreetly nearby, reminding them of their public situation. The spell had broken. They had separated, had left the shop by different doors, had parted without arranging another meeting because both knew further encounters would only deepen wounds that could not be healed. The Duke of Harrington's men had found their quarry 2 days later. Violet had been walking back to her lodgings from the circulating library when a familiar carriage had drawn alongside her, and her father himself had emerged. For a fleeting instant, as his eyes met hers, Violet saw something other than anger in their depths, a flash of raw relief that she was unharmed, a flicker of fear for the dangers she might have faced. But it was gone as quickly as it came, immediately submerged beneath a mask of controlled fury that promised consequences beyond her imagination. The Duke had not made a scene in the street. That would have been beneath his dignity. Instead, he had simply directed her into the carriage with a gesture that admitted no refusal. Violet had complied, knowing the futility of resistance, and had been transported back to Mayfair with the efficiency of a prisoner being returned to custody. The lecture that followed had been everything she had anticipated, and worse. His Grace had catalogued her offenses with the thoroughness of a prosecutor presenting evidence before the King's bench. She had embarrassed the family, had jeopardized the most important alliance he had ever negotiated, had behaved with the recklessness of a common girl rather than a lady of quality, and had, most unforgivably, placed her own selfish desires above her duty to her family and station. The Duchess had added her own recriminations, focusing on the danger Violet had courted by living unchaperoned in an unfashionable part of town. What if someone had recognized her? What if scandal had attached to her name? Did she not realize that one whisper of impropriety could destroy not only her own prospects, but those of her brother as well? Violet had endured these reproaches in silence, knowing that anything she said would only fuel her father's rage. She had been confined to her chambers, denied visitors, allowed no contact with the outside world. Agnes had been dismissed from service despite having served the family for 15 years. The Duke had made it clear that anyone who assisted his daughter's rebellion would face similar consequences. The betrothal ball, His Grace had informed her coldly, would proceed as planned. She would attend, would be presented to Mr. Pemberton, would conduct herself with the grace and propriety expected of a Harrington, and would then set a wedding date agreeable to both families. If she entertained any further notions of rebellion, he would see her married by special license before the week was out and confined to her husband's estate in Northumberland until she learned proper wifely obedience. Violet had spent the next 4 days in her gilded prison, her mind circling the same hopeless thoughts endlessly. She had destroyed her chance at happiness through her deception. Julian would never learn why she had refused him, would never know that the woman who loved him was the same Lady Violet Harrington he was meant to marry. He would think her a coward who had chosen duty over love, while she would be bound to a stranger, knowing true love existed somewhere beyond her reach. The evening of the betrothal ball had arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. Violet's maid, a new girl who regarded her with the wariness of one attending a dangerous animal, had dressed her in a gown of pale blue silk that had cost more than most families earned in a year. Sapphires glittered at her throat and ears, family jewels that proclaimed her status to anyone with eyes to see. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that required an hour to complete. She looked, she thought bitterly, while examining her reflection, like a prize mare being prepared for auction. The Duke and Duchess had collected her from her chamber with the solemnity of a funeral procession. They had descended to the grand ballroom, where hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, where the finest families of England had gathered to witness the announcement that would unite two great houses. Musicians played from the gallery, champagne flowed freely, and the air itself seemed weighted with expectation. Violet had been positioned near the entrance to the ballroom, flanked by her parents like a prisoner between guards. She had been instructed to smile, to appear pleased and honored, to perform her role in this elaborate charade. She had complied mechanically, her mind elsewhere, her heart already broken beyond repair. The announcement of the Pemberton family's arrival had sent a ripple through the assembled guests. Violet had not looked up immediately, had kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor, postponing the moment when she would have to face the stranger who had been chosen to be her husband. She had heard the rustle of silk as guests stepped aside to make way, had heard her father's voice raised in greeting, had felt the moment approaching like the executioner's axe. Only when her father had spoken her name, had called her forward to meet her intended, had she finally raised her eyes. What she saw had stopped her heart entirely. Walking toward her, dressed in formal evening attire that emphasized his handsome features, his dark hair properly arranged for once, his expression carefully neutral, was the man she knew as James Hartwell. Behind him walked an older couple who could only be his parents, their faces alight with satisfaction at the alliance being forged. But Violet saw none of them. She saw only Julian, her Julian, moving toward her with steps that seemed to require visible effort. The shock on his face mirrored her own. She watched recognition dawn, watched understanding follow, watched the same parade of emotions that must have been evident on her own features. His steps had faltered briefly before he mastered himself and continued forward with the bearing of a man approaching his doom. The Duke had made the formal introduction with considerable pride. Lady Violet Harrington, his beloved daughter, pearl of the season, finest young lady of her generation. Mr. Julian Pemberton, second son of the distinguished Pemberton family, gentleman of education and means, soon to be united in matrimony with his precious child. Julian had bowed with perfect correctness. Violet had curtsied with mechanical precision. They were there, 5 feet apart, staring at each other with the horror of condemned prisoners recognizing a fellow sufferer at the scaffold. The assembled guests had applauded politely, mistaking their shocked silence for maiden modesty and gentlemanly respect. The Duke had continued speaking, outlining the terms of the settlement with the pride of a general recounting a victorious campaign. The wedding would take place in 8 weeks' time at St. George's, Hanover Square. The couple would take up residence initially at the Pemberton Townhouse in Berkeley Square, then remove to the Pemberton country seat in Hertfordshire. A generous settlement had been arranged, provisions made, all details attended to with the thoroughness that characterized a transaction of such magnitude. Throughout this recitation, Violet and Julian had remained silent, locked in mutual recognition and mutual horror. Miss Hart was Lady Violet Harrington. James Hartwell was Julian Pemberton. The woman he loved was the woman he was meant to marry. The man she had chosen was the man chosen for her. The universe, it seemed, possessed a taste for cruel ironies. The Duke had finally finished his announcements and had suggested that the young couple might wish to take the floor for the first dance, as was traditional at betrothal balls. The musicians had struck up a waltz, that scandalous German dance that had only recently gained acceptance in the most fashionable circles. Julian had extended his hand with the stiffness of a man performing an unpleasant duty. Violet had placed her gloved fingers in his with the resignation of one accepting the inevitable. They had moved into the center of the ballroom, watched by hundreds of eyes, and had begun to dance. Julian's hand at her waist felt simultaneously strange and familiar, his touch sending recognition through her body even as her mind struggled to reconcile the man before her with the 2 different versions she had known. They danced in perfect synchronization, their bodies remembering the harmony their hearts had found, even as their minds reeled from revelation. It was Julian who had spoken first, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the music. He had asked a single question, simple and devastating. Had she known? Violet had answered honestly. No, she had not known. She had been fleeing from him, from the idea of him, from the arranged marriage her father had forced upon her. She had never imagined that the man she was escaping and the man she was falling in love with were one and the same. Had he known? Julian's response had carried equal anguish. No, he too had been escaping, had been hiding from the very arrangement that now bound them. He had spoken of his intended as a burden to be endured, had complained of being forced to marry a sharp-tongued blue-stocking, never knowing he was describing the woman whose wit and intelligence had captured his heart completely. The cruel perfection of their situation had become clear as they danced. They had each found exactly what they sought while fleeing from exactly what they had been given. They had fallen in love freely, honestly, without consideration of duty or advantage, only to discover that duty and advantage had already decreed their union. The choice they had fought to preserve, the freedom to love whom they wished, had been an illusion all along. Violet had felt tears threatening and had fought them back through sheer force of will. She would not cry in front of 500 witnesses, would not give the gossiping matrons of the Tun the satisfaction of seeing her distress. She had asked Julian what they should do now, her voice barely audible. Julian's response had been immediate and fierce. They should refuse the arrangement, should confess to their families that they had met already under different circumstances, should demand time to discover whether the love they had found as Hart and Hartwell could survive the revelation of their true identities. They should not let their parents' machinations dictate their heart's course. But even as he spoke, Violet could see the futility of such rebellion. They were already promised to each other. To refuse now would create scandal that would harm both their families. Their romance, rather than being seen as a fortunate coincidence, would be dismissed as improper conduct between affianced parties who had violated the proprieties. The very love they wished to protect would be twisted into something sordid by society's interpretation. More troubling still was the question neither wished to voice. Could their love survive the revelation of their mutual deception? Julian had fallen in love with Miss Hart, a woman of modest means and simple tastes. Would he still love Lady Violet Harrington, Duke's daughter and society princess? Violet had fallen in love with James Hartwell, a gentleman of independent mind and intellectual pursuits. Would she still love Julian Pemberton, second son of commercial wealth, trying to buy his way into aristocratic acceptance? The dance had ended. They had separated with the required courtesies, had been immediately claimed by other partners and well-wishers. Violet had been swept into a country dance with some baronet whose name she immediately forgot, her mother's hand a firm grip on her elbow. Julian had been cornered by his father and the Duke, both men clapping him on the shoulder, their satisfaction forming an impenetrable barrier. They had been carried along on the tide of social obligation, their chance for private discourse deliberately and efficiently severed. The ball had continued until the early hours of morning, but for Violet and Julian, it had been endless torture. They had been forced to play their roles, to accept congratulations, to smile and appear pleased while their minds raced through implications and possibilities. When finally the last guests had departed and Violet had been released to her chambers, she had collapsed onto her bed fully dressed, too exhausted even for tears. Sleep had proven impossible. She had replayed every conversation she had shared with Julian, examining them now through the lens of his true identity. Had he been sincere, or had he been playing some elaborate game? Had Miss Hart been more acceptable to him than Lady Violet would prove? The questions had circled endlessly, each more painful than the last. Morning had brought a note, delivered by a footman with instructions to place it directly into Lady Violet's hands. The handwriting had been Julian's, the message brief but devastating. He requested, not demanded, but requested with the formality of a stranger, the honor of calling upon her that afternoon. He wished to speak privately if she would grant him that courtesy. He signed it with his full name and title, Julian Pemberton, Esquire, as though the intimacy of their previous acquaintance had been erased entirely. Violet had received him in the drawing room at the appointed hour, the Duchess serving as chaperone as propriety demanded. Julian had arrived, dressed with formal correctness, his manner betraying nothing of their previous intimacy. He had asked permission to take Lady Violet for a drive in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, arguing that as betrothed parties, they might be granted some measure of privacy under society's watchful eye. The Duchess had agreed, pleased to see the young couple taking an interest in each other. Within the hour, Violet had found herself seated beside Julian in an elegant barouche, processing slowly along Rotten Row among all of fashionable London taking the air. It was, ironically, the most public privacy they could have achieved, surrounded by hundreds, yet granted the illusion of solitude by the noise and movement around them. Julian had begun speaking before they had traveled 50 yards, his words tumbling out with urgent intensity. He had spent the night examining his conscience and his heart, he explained, and had reached certain conclusions he needed to share. First, he owed her an abject apology for deceiving her about his identity, even though the deception had been initially inadvertent. He should have revealed himself the moment he realized their attachment was developing beyond casual acquaintance. Violet had interrupted to offer her own apology, equally heartfelt and equally necessary. She too had maintained a fiction long past the point of honesty. She too bore responsibility for the misunderstanding between them. Julian had waved away her apology impatiently, insisting she hear him out completely. He confessed that he had spent the early morning hours at his club, the dregs of a brandy bottle before him, laying bare his impossible situation to his closest friend. Major Alistair Finch, a cynical but clear-eyed man who had seen action at Waterloo, had listened patiently before swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "So, to be clear," the Major had drawled, "you fled an arranged marriage to a bluestocking, accidentally fell in love with an intelligent and spirited mystery woman, only to discover they are one and the same? He had taken a slow sip. Most men would call that Providence, Pemberton, not a predicament. The only question that matters is, do you love the woman herself, or merely the illusion of freedom she represented? The Major's question, Julian explained, had cut through the brandy-fueled haze, clarifying everything. The core observation was this: they loved each other. They had fallen in love honestly, without consideration of advantage or duty. The fact that they had been meant for each other all along did not diminish the authenticity of what they had discovered. If anything, it suggested that perhaps their families had recognized something they themselves had been too blind to see, that they were, in fact, ideally suited. Violet had protested that the situation was not so simple. How could they know their love was genuine when it had been built on false foundations? How could they trust emotions that had developed under false pretenses? How could they be certain they loved each other's true selves rather than the characters they had performed? Julian had countered each objection with the logic that had made their bookshop debates so stimulating. Miss Hart had not been a character, but rather Violet without her social armor, free to be herself without the weight of expectations. James Hartwell had not been a fiction, but rather Julian liberated from the burden of his family's ambitions. They had, in effect, met as their truest selves, unencumbered by the roles they were forced to play in society. He had then made a proposal that had stolen Violet's breath. He suggested they begin again, starting from this moment of honesty. They would court properly, as Julian Pemberton and Lady Violet Harrington, but with the knowledge of who they truly were beneath their titles. They would discover whether the connection they had found in bookshops and museums could survive translation to drawing rooms and ballrooms. They would give themselves the time their parents had denied them, even if that time existed within the framework of their arranged betrothal. If, after this proper courtship, they found that their love could not survive the reality of their circumstances, they would approach their families together and request release from the engagement. Julian was prepared to face his parents' disappointment. He would not trap Violet in a marriage she did not desire, even if refusing meant permanent estrangement from his family. But, and here his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, if they discovered that their love was real, that it could survive and even flourish in the light of truth, then they would embrace the extraordinary gift they had been given. They would accept an arranged marriage that had somehow become a love match. They would transform duty into choice, obligation into joy. Violet had found herself unable to respond immediately, overwhelmed by the generosity of his proposal. He was offering her everything she had claimed to want: freedom to choose, time to discover, honesty between them. Yet accepting meant risking her heart even more deeply than before. If they courted properly and found their love wanting, the loss would be even more painful than it already was. Julian had seemed to understand her hesitation. He had reached across the space between them, a gesture invisible to the crowds surrounding them, but enormously significant to Violet, and had taken her hand briefly before propriety demanded he release it. He had told her that he understood fear, understood doubt, but he believed they owed themselves the chance to discover what they might build together. They had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to fall in love with the person they were destined to marry. Most arranged matches offered no such luxury. Violet had felt something shift within her chest, some knot of tension beginning to loosen. Julian was right, she realized. She had been so focused on what she was losing, her freedom, her choice, her rebellion, that she had failed to see what she might be gaining. She had fallen in love with a man who challenged her intellect, respected her opinions, valued her mind as much as her person. The fact that this man had been chosen for her by her father did not diminish what they had shared. If anything, it suggested that perhaps her father's judgment had not been entirely mercenary. She had asked Julian what he wanted from her, what response he sought to his proposal. His answer had been simple and devastating in its honesty. He wanted the chance to love her properly, to court her as she deserved, to build something real between them. He wanted to discover whether the woman he had met in Hatchards and the Lady Violet Harrington of society could be one and the same. He wanted, ultimately, to marry her, not because their families decreed it, but because their hearts demanded it. Violet had taken a breath that seemed to draw courage from the autumn air. She had agreed to his proposal. They would court properly, would give themselves the time to discover whether their love could survive the truth of their identities. They would be honest with each other, would lower their defenses, would risk their hearts completely. And if, at the end of this courtship, they found themselves truly in love, not with who they had pretended to be, but with who they actually were, they would embrace the extraordinary coincidence that had made their arranged marriage into something chosen. Julian's expression had transformed, relief and joy replacing the careful neutrality he had maintained. He had wanted to kiss her, she could see, wanted to pull her into his arms in full view of Hyde Park, and propriety be damned. Instead, he had simply smiled at her with such warmth that she had felt it like physical touch, and had promised that he would court her so thoroughly, so properly, so completely that she would have no doubt of his affection by the time their wedding day arrived. The courtship that followed proved unlike any other in the annals of London society. Julian Pemberton and Lady Violet Harrington, already betrothed, already committed to marry, proceeded to fall in love with all the intensity of star-crossed lovers, discovering each other for the first time. They attended every ball, opera, and social gathering the season offered, yet their attention remained fixed entirely on each other. They took daily drives in the park, visited galleries and museums together with proper chaperonage, and spent hours in conversation that scandalized no one because they were, after all, engaged to be married. Yet everyone who observed them remarked on the unusual nature of their attachment. They talked constantly, their conversations animated and engaged in a way that suggested genuine intellectual connection rather than mere social pleasantries. They laughed together with the ease of old friends, yet looked at each other with the wonder of new lovers. They seemed, in short, to be experiencing both the comfort of long acquaintance and the excitement of fresh discovery. The Duke of Harrington observed these developments with barely concealed satisfaction. He congratulated himself on his wisdom in arranging the match, certain that his daughter's obvious happiness vindicated his judgment. The fact that Violet and Julian had needed no time at all to develop affection proved, he declared to anyone who would listen, that people of quality simply recognize their natural complements when properly introduced. What His Grace did not know, what no one save Violet and Julian themselves knew, was that they were learning each other anew with every encounter. The Julian who danced with Lady Violet at Almack's was different from the James who had debated with Miss Hart in bookshops, yet recognizably the same in all essential ways. The Violet who accompanied Julian to the opera was different from the Hart who had walked freely through museum galleries, yet possessed the same keen mind and independent spirit beneath her fashionable gowns. They discovered, in those weeks of proper courtship, that their love had not been an illusion born of temporary freedom. If anything, it deepened as they revealed more of themselves to each other. Julian confessed his insecurities about being a second son, about feeling he must constantly prove his worth beyond his family's wealth. Violet admitted her fears about losing herself in marriage, about being reduced to an ornament rather than treated as a partner. In response to these confessions, they made promises to each other that had nothing to do with the formal vows they would eventually exchange. Julian promised never to dismiss her opinions, never to expect her to be less intelligent or less informed than she was, never to confine her to drawing rooms when she wished to engage with the wider world. Violet promised to trust him with her authentic self, to stop hiding behind defensive wit and sharp remarks, to believe that he valued her mind as highly as he desired her person. 6 weeks into their engagement, Julian had secured permission to visit Violet in her father's library, that sanctuary where she had spent so much of her childhood. They had settled among the leather-bound volumes with cups of tea and a book of Donne's poetry that Julian had brought as a gift. It was there, surrounded by words written by others, that Julian had finally spoken the confession that had been building since their reconciliation. He had told her that he loved her completely, not the Miss Hart he had met in Hatchard's, not the Lady Violet of the drawing rooms, but the whole complex person she actually was. He loved her sharp mind and her generous heart, her fierce independence and her capacity for tenderness, her rebellious spirit and her sense of duty. He loved the woman who could debate philosophy with passion and arrange flowers with care, who could ride fearlessly yet play the pianoforte with delicacy. He loved every contradiction and complexity that made her uniquely herself. Violet had responded with her own confession, equally comprehensive. She loved Julian's mind and his kindness, his ambition and his humility, his strength and his vulnerability. She loved that he challenged her without diminishing her, supported her without constraining her, desired her without objectifying her. She loved the man who was confident enough to admit uncertainty, privileged enough to recognize his advantages, and wise enough to value substance over appearance. They had sat there in the library, hands clasped between them, and had made peace with the extraordinary situation in which they found themselves. They would marry as their families had arranged, but they would do so as two people choosing each other freely. The obligation that had seemed like a cage had become instead a gift, one that most people never received. The wedding took place on a crisp December morning at St. George's, Hanover Square, with all of fashionable London in attendance. Lady Violet Harrington walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a gown of white silk embroidered with seed pearls, her face barely concealed by Brussels lace. Julian Pemberton waited at the altar, his expression betraying none of the complex emotions he felt. Joy at marrying the woman he loved, gratitude for the chance they had been given, determination to build the partnership they had promised each other. The ceremony itself followed traditional forms, the ancient words binding them together in the sight of God and society. Yet when they exchanged their vows, when Julian placed his ring on Violet's finger and she responded with promises of her own, both knew they were choosing this union as surely as if they had fled to Scotland against all opposition. The arrangement that had seemed like tyranny had become, through unexpected grace, a foundation for authentic love. The wedding breakfast at Harrington House proved a triumph of social engineering, with both families radiating satisfaction at the alliance they had forged. Toasts were offered praising the wisdom of arranged matches, the importance of compatible backgrounds, the superiority of practical considerations over fleeting romantic sentiments. Neither Violet nor Julian contradicted these pronouncements. They simply smiled at each other across the table, sharing private amusement at how thoroughly wrong and yet somehow right their family's theories proved. As evening fell and the newlyweds prepared to depart for the Pemberton country seat, Julian had drawn Violet aside for a private moment. He mentioned quietly that he had dispatched his man of business that very morning to locate Agnes. The faithful maid would be offered a generous pension and a position as head housekeeper at one of their smaller country properties, should she wish it. Violet's gratitude was a silent, brilliant thing in her eyes. It was their first act as a true partnership. It was then, in the conservatory where hothouse flowers bloomed despite winter's grip, that Julian gave her a gift, a leather-bound journal with blank pages waiting to be filled. He explained that he wished for them to write their own story, one that began not with their family's machinations, but with a chance meeting in a bookshop. They would fill these pages with the truth of their relationship, creating a record that belonged to them alone. Their children would read it someday and learn that even arranged marriages could become love matches when two people were brave enough to choose each other, despite knowing they had already been chosen. Inside the carriage, traveling through the deepening twilight towards Hertfordshire, Violet opened the leather-bound journal Julian had given her. She read the first line aloud, her voice soft in the enclosed space. This is the true story of how Lady Violet Harrington and Julian Pemberton fell in love. Twice. Julian watched her, the lights of a passing inn flickering across his features. He reached out, not for her hand, but to gently trace the words on the page with his finger. a far better story than the one they will tell in the drawing rooms," he said. She looked up from the page, her eyes meeting his. "It is our story," she replied, "and it is only just beginning." He leaned in then, and as the carriage carried them towards their future, he closed the small distance between them, sealing the promise not with words, but with a kiss that was both a beginning and a long-awaited homecoming. They had fled from each other only to be brought together by the very fate they had tried to escape. They had fallen in love freely, only to discover their love had been predetermined. They had fought against an arranged marriage only to embrace it as the greatest gift they could have received. And in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the universe possesses wisdom that surpasses human understanding, that destiny and choice are not always opposing forces, and that the heart can find its home even in circumstances initially chosen by others. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, and sometimes, in the most delicious of ironies, finds its path precisely where duty has already paved the road. The arranged marriage that Lady Violet Harrington had fled became the love match she had always dreamed of, proving once again that Providence occasionally demonstrates a sense of humor in matters of the heart. One can only hope that somewhere in a Hertfordshire manor, a leather-bound journal grows thick with pages chronicling a partnership built on equal parts destiny and determination, obligation and affection, fate and freedom. For in the end, dearest listeners, it matters not how love begins, whether by chance encounter or calculated arrangement, whether by rebellion or resignation. What matters is that two hearts, meeting in truth and choosing each other in freedom, have found the rarest treasure society can offer, a marriage that satisfies both the demands of duty and the desires of the soul.